There is a stretch of coastline in Western Ireland where the cliffs drop straight into the Atlantic, and on the night of the 21st of September, 1588, a ship came out of the dark toward them under bare poles. She had no anchor. The men aboard her could see the surf breaking white at the base of the rocks. They could hear it over the wind, and there was nothing any of them could do about it, because the thing that stops a ship from being driven onto a shore was lying on the seabed off Calais, 400 miles behind them, where her captain had cut the cable 6 weeks earlier to escape a fire he thought was going to kill him. She was one of 130 ships that had sailed from Lisbon in May. She was carrying men who had been at sea for 4 months, eating spoiled food, drinking water that had gone green in the barrels. Some of them had been soldiers in Flanders. Some had been pressed off the docks in Andalusia and had never seen open ocean before that summer. The wind took her broadside and put her on the rocks, and the Atlantic did the rest. That night was not unusual. That autumn, along the coasts of Scotland and Ireland, it happened again and again, to ship after ship, until the greatest fleet in Europe had been reduced to a scatter of wreckage on beaches whose names nobody aboard could pronounce. The English had barely sunk any of them. This is the story of how the weather destroyed the Spanish Armada, and of the 6 days of fighting that made the weather lethal. If you want more naval history told this way, subscribing helps us keep making it. Start with what Philip II of Spain was actually trying to do, because the popular version gets it wrong. He was not trying to win a sea battle. He did not need to win a sea battle. The Armada was not an invasion force. It was an escort. The invasion force was already in place. It was sitting in Flanders, in what is now Belgium, under the Duke of Parma, somewhere around 16,000 veteran soldiers, the best infantry in Europe, men who had spent a decade grinding down Dutch rebels and were very good at what they did. Parma had barges. What Parma did not have was a way to get those barges across the channel without the English and the Dutch sinking every one of them. That was the Armada's job. Sail up the channel, meet Parma, cover the crossing, put 16,000 professional soldiers on English soil, and if that had happened, the odds are it works. England in 1588 had no standing army worth the name. Elizabeth had militia, and militia does not stand against the army of Flanders. Philip was not gambling on a naval victory. He was gambling on a rendezvous. So the question that hangs over everything that follows is not why Spain lost a battle. It is why two forces that were both exactly where they were supposed to be never managed to meet. The man Philip chose to command the Armada did not want the job and said so in writing. In February of 1588, the Marquis of Santa Cruz died. Santa Cruz was Spain's most experienced admiral. He had spent years planning this operation, and his death left the fleet without a commander 8 weeks before it was meant to sail. Philip appointed Alonso Pérez de Guzmán, the 7th Duke of Medina Sidonia. The Duke was one of the richest men in Europe, an able administrator, and by every account a decent human being. He was also 37 years old and had never commanded a fleet, never fought a naval battle, and got seasick. He wrote back to the king. He said he had no experience of war at sea or on land. He said he knew nothing about the English. He asked to be excused. Philip refused, and the historians have been arguing about that decision ever since. The most persuasive explanation is not that Philip misjudged him. It is that Philip wanted someone who would follow orders exactly. Santa Cruz would have improvised. Medina Sidonia would do what the letter said, which is precisely what he did, and it is one of the reasons the campaign failed. The fleet that left Lisbon at the end of May was enormous, and it was not what the paper said it was. Something around 130 ships. The number varies depending on which contemporary list you trust, and modern historians put it anywhere from 120 to 130, around 27,000 men, roughly 1,100 guns, but only a fraction of those hulls were purpose-built warships. Philip had planned for 50 royal galleons. He got about 13. The rest of the fighting corps was made up of a handful of galleasses, some armed merchantmen, and then a long tail of hired and requisitioned trading vessels. Slow, deep in the water, some of them rotten, most of them designed to carry cargo and not to fight. He also had the wrong sailors. Spain simply did not have enough trained seamen to man a fleet that size, so men were pressed from inland towns as well as coastal ones. That gave the Armada crews. It did not give it seamanship, and the provisions were already going bad. The fleet had been assembled and victualled, and then delayed again and again, and salt beef and biscuit and water do not wait. Before the Armada had fired a shot, men aboard it were getting sick from what they were eating. The man waiting for them on the English side had spent his entire career stealing from Spain. Francis Drake was, depending on which capital you asked, the most successful sailor alive or a pirate with a knighthood. He had circumnavigated the globe. He had taken Spanish treasure ships in the Pacific. The year before, he had sailed into Calais harbor and burned the stores Santa Cruz was assembling for this very expedition. He called it singeing the King of Spain's beard, and it delayed the Armada by a year. There is a famous story about him. The Armada is sighted off the Lizard, the news reaches Plymouth, and Drake is playing bowls on the Hoe. He is told the Spanish are coming. He says there is time to finish the game and beat the Spaniards too. That story first appears in print 36 years after the event. No contemporary account mentions it. What is documented is that the tide was flooding into Plymouth Sound that afternoon, and no English ship could have got out of that harbor for several hours no matter how urgently anyone wanted to. So Drake may well have finished his game. He would not have been able to leave either way. The fleet he was part of was a different kind of force entirely. Somewhere near 200 vessels, though that number is misleading. Only about 34 were royal warships, and most of the rest were private ships of very mixed quality. Around 16,000 men, and here is the difference that mattered. Only about 1,500 of them were soldiers. The Spanish ships carried soldiers because Spanish naval doctrine was to close, grapple, and board. A sea fight, in the Spanish understanding, was a land battle that happened to take place on wooden platforms. You brought infantry, you got alongside, and you took the enemy ship with steel. The English had spent 20 years building something different. Lower in the water, faster, more weatherly, able to sail closer to the wind, and armed with heavier long guns mounted on carriages that could be worked in action. Their doctrine was simple, and at the time, close to unproven. Do not board, stand off and shoot. Command sat with Lord Howard of Effingham, an aristocrat and a courtier with limited experience at sea, who had the sense to listen to the men under him. Drake, John Hawkins, Martin Frobisher, privateers, most of them, who knew that water and knew what Spanish ships could and could not do. The Armada came up the channel in a crescent. This formation is the single most important tactical fact of the campaign, and it worked. The strongest fighting ships were placed on the wings and in the center. The vulnerable transports and supply hulks sat inside the curve. Anything attacking the formation had to come through the guns. Anything trying to cut out a straggler found the wings folding back to cover it. For 6 days, from the 21st of July, the English attacked and could not break it. They followed. They fired at long range. They took the weather gauge, the upwind position, and they harried the Spanish rear. And the crescent kept its shape and kept moving up the channel, exactly as planned, toward the rendezvous. Both sides were learning things during those 6 days. The English learned that their long-range gunnery was not doing much. They were firing from too far out, and the shot that hit was not penetrating the heavy Spanish hulls. The Spanish learned something worse, and they had no way to fix it at sea. Their heavy guns were not being reloaded, not slowly, not inefficiently. In many cases, not at all. Once a Spanish ship had fired its opening salvo, the big guns on that ship went quiet for the rest of the engagement, and the English ships pouring shot into her were being answered by musket fire. Historians have argued for 40 years about exactly why. The traditional answer is the gun carriages. Spanish heavy guns sat on long two-wheeled carriages of the type armies used ashore, around 3 feet longer than the English equivalent. And the argument goes that there was no room to haul them inboard and work them on a crowded gun deck. That explanation has been challenged. At least one Spanish historian has measured the decks of the great galleons and concluded there was room. Other suspects have been proposed. Bronze guns of that era overheated badly under sustained fire, and an overheated bronze gun begins to deform. Shot had been cast for specific guns and then thrown into piles indiscriminately, so a crew reloading in the dark and the smoke might not find a ball that fit. But underneath the technical argument is something nobody disputes, and it is not really technical at all. The Spanish crews had never been trained to do it. Spanish naval doctrine held that a gun fired once. You closed with the enemy, you fired your salvo, and then the gun crews, who were soldiers, left the guns and went up on deck to board. One man stayed below with a slow match. That was the entire drill. It was a coherent system. It had worked for a century. It only failed when the enemy refused to come close enough to be boarded. So whatever the mechanical reason, the effect was the same. The Armada could throw one heavy salvo. After that, for practical purposes, its main battery was decorative. Nobody on either side fully understood this yet. It would take one more day at close range for it to become obvious. Medina Sidonia had done exactly what his orders told him to do, and he had done it well. In 4 days he would find out what those orders had left out. On the 7th of August, the Armada anchored off Calais. Medina Sidonia had done what Philip ordered. He had brought the fleet up the channel intact, in formation, against everything the English could do, and he was now within a day's sail of Parma. Then the message came back from Flanders, and the entire operation came apart. Parma was not ready. He had only learned the Armada was arriving on the day it arrived. His men needed 6 more days to embark, and it did not matter anyway, because Parma's ports were blockaded, not by the English, but by the Dutch, with a swarm of small shallow-draft flyboats sitting off Dunkirk. The Armada could not clear that blockade. Its ships drew too much water to get in close. The Dutch boats could operate in shallows. The Spanish galleons could not enter. There was no deep-water port on that entire coast where the Armada could shelter. There never had been. This was the flaw at the center of Philip's plan, and it had been there from the beginning, sitting inside the orders like a fault line, invisible to a commander who had been told to follow the letter. So Medina Sidonia sat at anchor off Calais with 130 ships in a tight defensive cluster, unable to go forward, unable to go back, in an open roadstead, with the English fleet a few miles to windward. The English had never had a better target, and they knew it. At around midnight on the 8th of August, the English took 8 ships, packed them with pitch, tar, and gunpowder, loaded their guns so they would fire as the flames reached them, set them alight, and let the wind and the tide carry them down onto the anchored Armada. The Spanish were expecting fire ships. What they were afraid of was something worse. 3 years earlier at Antwerp, the Dutch had sent floating bombs into a Spanish bridge of boats, vessels packed with gunpowder and scrap iron on delayed fuses. They called them hellburners. They had killed something like 800 men in a few seconds. There were men in the Armada that night who had been at Antwerp. 2 of the fire ships were intercepted and towed aside. 6 came on, and the Armada, which had held formation for 6 days against everything the English Navy could do, broke in about 10 minutes. Ships cut their anchor cables rather than take the time to haul the anchors up. That is the detail to hold on to. In the dark, with fire coming down on the tide, captain after captain took an axe to the cable and let the anchor go. They scattered downwind and downtide, out of the roadstead, toward the shoals off Dunkirk. One galleass fouled another ship, lost her steering, and drove ashore. When Medina Sidonia got his flagship anchored again and fired a signal gun to reassemble, most of the fleet was too far away in the dark to hear it. Not one Spanish ship was burned that night. The fireships did not need to burn anything. They had done the only thing that mattered. They had taken the crescent apart, and they had put a few hundred anchors on the bottom of the channel, which would turn out to matter more than anything else that happened in 1588. At dawn on the 9th of August, off the Flemish town of Gravelines, the English caught the Armada scattered and close to a range they had not dared use before. This was the battle. Everything before it was maneuvering. The English came in to within 100 yards or less and worked their guns as fast as their crews could serve them. Load, run out, fire, haul in, load again, hour after hour. The Spanish fired their opening broadsides and then could not reload. The crews went to the rails with muskets and arquebuses and shot back with small arms at ships that were hitting them with cannon. For 8 hours the Armada took a battering it could not answer. Hulls were holed at the waterline. Rigging came down. The casualty figures for that single day run to more than 600 dead and around 800 wounded, though as with every number in this campaign, the sources disagree. And here is the number that the whole story turns on. At the end of 8 hours of the heaviest close-range gunfire anyone had yet seen at sea, the Armada had lost 5 ships. 5 out of 130, and even that figure needs splitting. Of those 5, the number actually sunk by English gunfire was 1 or possibly 2. The accounts disagree. The rest were driven onto the Flemish shoals, or crippled and taken by the Dutch, or run aground and abandoned. The English fleet had fought the best action of its existence at ranges nobody had dared before for an entire day, and had put perhaps 2 enemy ships on the bottom. By late afternoon, both fleets were nearly out of powder. The wind was pushing the Armada toward the Zealand sandbanks, where it would have gone aground and been destroyed completely. And then the wind shifted to the southwest and carried it clear into the open North Sea. Howard did not pursue hard. He wrote afterward that he believed most of the Spanish ships were so badly damaged they would sink before they reached port. He was wrong about the mechanism and right about the outcome. Because the Armada was not sunk, it was crippled. And there is a difference, and the difference is what killed those men. Medina Sidonia took stock in the North Sea and found that he still had 110 ships. By any normal accounting, that is a fleet. It is a larger fleet than most nations in Europe could put to sea at all. 2/3 of it would in fact make it home. But the ships were shot through. The rigging was cut. The crews were dying of typhus and dysentery and starvation. The water was foul, and the food had been bad since June. And the ships had no anchors. Turning back into the channel was impossible with the wind where it was, and the English were still there. So Medina Sidonia gave the only order available to him. North, around the top of Scotland, down the Atlantic coast of Ireland, and home to Spain. He wrote out sailing instructions for the whole fleet and set a course that kept well clear of the Irish coast. It was a reasonable plan, and on paper it should have worked. What he could not know was that the autumn of 1588 would produce some of the worst weather in the North Atlantic in living memory. The gales came in September, and they came from the west, and they pushed the fleet toward a lee shore, a coastline with the wind blowing onto it, which is the thing every sailor fears most, because there is nowhere to go. This is the moment when everything that happened in the Channel came due. A ship caught on a lee shore in a gale has one real option: anchor, get iron into the seabed, ride it out, and hope the cable holds until the wind changes. The Armada had cut its anchors off Calais. Ship after ship came down onto the coasts of Scotland and Ireland with no way to stop. They struck rocks in the dark. They rolled over in the surf. 24 of them, at least, went to pieces on the Irish shore alone, at Streedaw, at Blasket Sound, at a dozen beaches where local people watched hundreds of men come ashore through the surf and die there. Of the men who reached land alive, many were killed by English troops in Ireland under standing orders. Some were sheltered, most simply drowned. By the time the survivors reached Spanish ports in the autumn, the accounting was this: somewhere between 44 and 60 ships lost, somewhere between 11 and 20,000 men dead, and the range is that wide because nobody counted the men who died of disease after making harbor. The English lost no ships at all. They lost men, thousands of them, from disease, in the weeks after the fighting, in port, unpaid, sailors who had beaten the Armada and then died of typhus in Margate because the Crown would not feed them. Howard spent his own money trying to keep them alive. Medina Sidonia came home broken. He had begged not to be given the command, he had carried it out to the letter, and he was blamed for it. He asked to be relieved, and Philip finally let him go. He lived another 31 years. Philip's reaction is the strangest part of the story. He took the news calmly, and he said that he had sent his ships against men, not against wind and waves. That line has been quoted for 400 years as excuse-making. It was, in a narrow sense, accurate. The English did not sink his fleet. The Atlantic did, but that framing hides the mechanism, and the mechanism is the whole point. The weather destroyed the Armada. The weather could only destroy the Armada because the fleet went into the Atlantic with cut cables, no anchors, hulls holed at the waterline, and crews too sick to work the ships. And it went into the Atlantic at all because a fireship attack at midnight scattered a formation that 6 days of gunfire had failed to break. Take away Calais and the Armada rides out those September gales at anchor, damaged, hungry, humiliated, and afloat. Spain did not collapse. Philip rebuilt the fleet. The war ran on for another 16 years, and England's own attempt to invade Spain the following year failed just as completely. But something did change in 1588, and it was not the balance of power. It was the answer to a technical question. For a century, the argument at sea had been whether a warship was a platform for soldiers or a platform for guns. Gravelines answered it. 8 hours of close-range fire against ships that could not reload settled the doctrine of naval warfare for the next 250 years. Every fleet action from that day to Trafalgar was fought by ships built on the principle the English proved off the Flemish coast, that the gun, worked fast and worked close, beats the boarding party. And it was proven by a fleet that, in 8 hours of the heaviest fighting of the age, sank 2 ships. The next one is Trafalgar, the battle that ended the age those guns began, fought by a man who understood better than anyone that a fleet's job is not to win. It is to destroy.